It's been less than a month since Donald Trump's return to power, and seismic shifts are being sent through the world of politics almost every day. Arguably, though, no field has been as affected by his return to power as foreign and development aid. So, is this the end of international assistance programs as we know them? Join me tonight to find out here on Wider View. And I'm your host, Mateusz Mazzini. Good evening. Our main story tonight focuses on money, or more specifically, money transferred from wealthy northern democracies into the developing economies of the global south. For the past few decades, this flow of financial, medical, educational, and other types of resources has been referred to as development aid. Now, some, including US State Secretary Marco Rubio, are calling it an unnecessary act of charity. Donald Trump's decision to effectively scrap all American development funding was a traumatic event for the entire sector. Not only did he eliminate USAID, but he also cancelled all American commitments across multilateral bodies. This means shortage of funding for UNICEF, UNHCR, and a lot of other bodies. As a result, a host of development programs will cease to exist. Distribution of drugs preventing HIV in Africa, veteran information centers in Ukraine, and the dismantling of landmines in Southeast Asia, just to name a few. Will other countries follow America's example? And will it mark the end of development aid as we know it? We explore the state of this field in our report.
The total budget of USAID, America's Foreign and Development Aid Agency, totaled $44 billion in 2024. Much of that was transferred to Ukraine, which became the largest recipient of the US's financial help over the last years. But it's important to remember that this was not the full amount of Washington's contributions to the sector. A lot of American money was being transferred to multilateral bodies, especially to various UN agencies. UNHCR, the UN's refugee agency, lost a fifth of its budget due to Trump's funding freeze. The agency's director, Filippo Grandi, has already asked his staff to pause all non-essential operations and spending procedures. Other institutions will also be dramatically affected because the scale of US aid operations has been enormous. In Latin America, funding was cut off to UN projects protecting the Amazon. A number of initiatives providing education to young girls in Afghanistan will no longer operate. International disaster relief, an increasingly important part of development aid, will be significantly reduced across all of Southeast Asia. The list goes on and spans pretty much every country on the planet. Trump's decision triggered a debate on whether foreign aid has a future at all. Some are calling for the European Union to fill the void left by the US. Others, especially right-wing leaders, are demanding a reform of the entire sector. Marco Rubio promises to bring in a greater involvement of the private sector. But at the same time, UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer has announced his willingness to double Britain's spending in this space. Development aid faces a turbulent year, and even with European help, it will likely never be the same as before Trump's return to office.
Is this the end of Western aid as we know it? Who could carry that burden in the absence of American commitments? And could it be high time to revisit the most fundamental aspects of this very concept? The international community needs to do some deep soul-searching on the topic of international development aid. And what better way to start than by asking experts on Wider View? Joining me tonight are Christina Beige, researcher from the Free University of Brussels, and Jonathan Glennie from the International Global Cooperation Institute. Good evening both, and welcome to Wider View. I want to start with you, Christina, because most people devoted their attention to the topic of development aid in recent weeks, obviously due to the changes implemented by the Trump administration at USAID. Can you summarize for us what actually happened at the agency and what changes have been implemented to American foreign assistance since Donald Trump returned to power?
Sure. Well, thank you for having me on the program. I think the introductory video pretty much set the scene, but what we saw soon after President Trump taking office was a 90-day freeze on U.S. foreign development assistance, pending review of efficiencies and consistency with his foreign policy. We quickly saw that a State Department cable stated that senior officials should ensure that no new obligations shall be made for foreign assistance. And shortly after, the senior career leadership within USAID and thousands of mid-level staff from the agency were dismissed, and numerous implementing partners and implementing organizations received immediate stop work orders to basically crippling the agency and preventing it from carrying out its legislative mandated responsibilities to do development assistance.
So I'm going to jump on this. I'm going to interrupt you real quick and ask you to unpack the meaning of the term stop work order, because we don't really have a similar tool, a legal instrument, be it a federal or a local one, pretty much nowhere in Europe. So what does that mean in practical terms to people who actually receive funding from USAID?
Well, the alarming bit is that there's questions about the legality of such a stop work order. It essentially forces any implementing organizations from carrying out programs. And these are programs that are under a budget that was already mandated and approved by Congress. So we are in fiscal year 2025. So this is not programming that has been newly appropriated by Congress. It's actually programming that was already appropriated by Congress before the Trump administration assumed or took up into the White House. There have been different legal cases that have already been submitted to different local courts pushing back against the legality. But it definitely sent a shockwave, I would say, amongst the development community, because the stop work order also came along with notice that if you were to continue to do programming, there could be legal ramifications for those implementing organizations.
So, Jonathan, moving over to you, how important has USAID been for the entire global ecosystem of development aid? Because it's not just about the money. $44 billion in one fiscal year might not seem like a gigantic sum for the needs of the global community. It was also about influence, wasn't it?
Yeah, of course. And that's, at the heart of the kind of contradiction of the whole kind of Trump logic behind this. It's definitely not just about dollars. The whole aid infrastructure, and one of the reasons why actually, it does need to change, is that it's not just about dollars being spent. It's about influence being peddled and change being implemented. And some of that has been amazing, and USAID has been a part of some really important changes and some really important funding over the years. But some of it's been, more so in kind of, let's say, classic US interests, and that's the kind of thing that's been criticized. Not just by many parts of the ecosystem. So I do think it's worth reflecting, though. I mean, it is fascinating that you said there's not even such a thing as a stop work order. I've never heard that phrase before, and it just does demonstrate that however much the aid system does indeed need to change, what's been done by the Trump administration is kind of like vandalism. I mean, it's not done in a responsible, thoughtful way. I mean, a new leader has the right to shift policy, but to do it in the way that he has and his team has is deliberately creating havoc and will lead to short-term impacts for real people in terms of receiving health care, in terms of girls in school, in terms of jobs. Human rights, so many things that the USAID is supporting. And indeed, it's not just about USAID, it's about US money to multilateral organizations and UN organizations, as you said in the opener. So, there are things that need to be done to the aid system to improve it for the 21st century. But this is definitely not the way to do it.
So let's talk a little bit on the consequences of that act of political vandalism. Back to you, Christina, because at the other end of that equation are countries that have been receiving substantial financial, educational, healthcare assistance via USAID and other programs. These countries will not be able to fill that void themselves. So what's next for conflict-affected areas or other emerging economies in the absence of American commitments to development?
I think it's very worrying. It's not only a withdrawal of U.S. foreign aid, though. I mean, we can see that there has been a decline of overseas development assistance. I mean, just recently with this last week, the new Belgian government agreement calls for a 25% budget reduction to invest in international cooperation. And we also saw in France that there are voices that are trying to reduce the international cooperation budget for up to 40% or up by 40%. So while the U.S. International development aid is by large the biggest portion of international global development assistance, we can also see another worrying trend, which is a decline in some of the EU member states pushing back against international cooperation. So we know that the European Union as a collective is actually the largest donor of international aid, but that's a collective of 27 member states. But when you look at it from a bilateral level, the U.S. still is the largest donor.
So building up on what you just said, and coming back to you, Jonathan, if it's not the U.S., then who? Because we see right now on the screen a very important piece of data, how important American funding has been to development aid globally. Christina mentioned both multilaterally and bilaterally. In the absence of this American money, these American dollars, could the European Union potentially fill that void, especially taking into consideration that it hasn't been particularly committed to that cause in previous years?
Well, I mean, a number of ways to answer that question. I mean, I think the first thing to say is, what Donald Trump and his administration want to do is to kind of say it's over. They want to send the message that they've won, that there's no more multilateral funding or bilateral funding, that aid is dead. That's not true at all. Yeah, that's the message they want us to believe. Trump could quite easily have lost this election if Biden hadn't kind of disappeared, and he could, and his movement could quite easily lose in 4 years. So there is a really important, urgent gap to fill. The question of where might this money come from in the very short term? Clearly, the billionaire foundations are looking at their budgets. Other responsible countries are looking at their budgets. Famously, the Chinese are looking at their budgets, which is another reason why the whole logic of Trump pulling out is so crazy. But you ask, can Europe find the money? Of course it can. It's a tiny amount of money. That's another irony of talking about this as if it's large amounts of money. Billions always sounds like it's a lot in a global scale, and in terms of the proportion of EU governments' GDP, it's a tiny amount of money. So the answer is yes, but as Christina just said, it's very unlikely to happen because there is a narrative that says we don't have this money in Europe at the moment. And crucially, it's been presented as, and we've used the word about 100 times already today, aid, right? It's presented as charity. And when you present something as charity and things aren't going great in your own economy, it's very easy to cut. You go to Parliament and say, we haven't got the money to give this charity. Actually, we should be talking about this, and we should have been for many years, as an investment in our common good as a globe with immediate direct benefits to contributors and also indirect benefits to contributors. And we need to sell that much better to the public and to politicians so that it doesn't make sense to cut this money. This is in our interest to put this money forward, but we failed to make that case. And that's what enables the Trumps and the other kind of vandals to go and say, it's over. We can't spend this money.
Well, I think this marks another contradiction in the political philosophy, if there is one, of the Trump administration. The American economy is not really doing so poorly, especially compared to the European ones. So there could be an argument in favor of increasing foreign spending, not decreasing it. But coming back to you, Christina, and let's discuss another aspect of this puzzle, which is American contribution to multilateral organizations. And we see that on the screen right now, using data from the Brookings institutions, America has been a major contributor to various United Nations ecosystem institutions. We've heard about UNICEF, UNHCR, the UN Refugee Agency, and others. Will this mark, or has it already marked, an earthquake for the UN ecosystem as well?
Oh, certainly. I mean, the U.S. Is the largest bilateral donor, for instance, not only to the UN's core contributing budget, I think it's around 22%, clearly ranks as one of the highest donors to the different UN agencies. So it hovers around 40% of the World Food Program, for instance. But I think another alarming action, or reckless action, I would say, by the Trump administration has also been the withdrawal, for instance, from the UN Human Rights Council, the World Health Organization, the Paris Climate Agreement. And maybe I just reiterate what Jonathan says. I mean, those of us working in this space, I would say, are probably not under any illusion that development assistance is not, I mean, it's a government tool. It's one of the 3 Ds of a state's foreign policy toolkit, right? You have development, you have defense, and you have diplomacy. But I guess the bigger question is there any, can you capitalize on the government funding that is allocated for that space to do good, to actually address the structural inequalities and address those dynamics that reinforce inequalities globally and contribute to global development and progress at the meantime, or in the meanwhile?
I'm going to stay with you, Christina, on this and play the devil's advocate here for a little bit, for purposes of an intellectual exercise. Let's listen to U.S. State Secretary Marco Rubio laying out the case for slashing the budgets of USAID, precisely because he sees this as charity, not development aid. And let's try to understand how they see this philosophy.
We froze foreign aid so that we can review those programs. The waiver process exists so that we can review those programs. Today, here, we've issued waivers for programs that make all the sense in the world. They make America safer. They make America stronger.
So Rubio and Trump seem to be willing to introduce a greater share of private sector commitments into foreign assistance. What would that look like?
Well, maybe just before answering that, I just want to remind everyone that USAID was established in 1961 by President John F. Kennedy with a clear understanding that humanitarian aid is both a moral responsibility and also a strategic investment in global stability, which in turn has an impact on our own security and stability. That's the logic behind it. I'm not so sure about the argument about the privatization of the development space. All that to say that the mastermind, I would say, or the right-hand man of Trump at the time, or the hour of the day, is Elon Musk, who has a net worth of $400 billion US. USAID's entire budget is less than 1.5% of his net worth. So I'm not sure in which angle they're interested in privatizing the development space. That's all to say that USAID already relies heavily on American companies and on companies around the world, worldwide, to provide goods and services to the USAID and to the U.S. development assistance ecosystem. So it's about maybe more the question that I would ask is what kind of private sector are they interested in infusing in the development space? Are they interested in encouraging the companies that are already in the ecosystem that act responsibly, that pay their employees a fair and just wage, ensure that they provide health and safety standards, they allow their employees to unionize, for instance? Or are they interested in a private sector that reflects, the uber rich of the world who frankly don't pay enough in their taxes? And if they were to do so, would also provide a lot more infusion of development assistance into the global community.
So, Jonathan, I want to come back to you right now. But before I lay out my question, I want to play another clip of Samantha Power, the former head of USAID, being interviewed by no one else than Stephen Colbert himself on CBS The Late Night Show.
Well, one of the things that we were so focused on is how do we turn the taxpayer resources that are given to us into more? So we actually, over the last 4 years, increased private sector contributions to development and humanitarian causes by about 40%.
You sort of did that already, Jonathan, on our show tonight. But if you could, please lay out an economic argument in favor of development and foreign assistance assistance performed by the US government in Global South and other emerging economies? What would that sound like?
Well, I mean, and the first thing to say, and like Christina reflected on this, is that, the fact that we're only talking about US interests at the moment is a distortion of how the US and every country and decent government in the world has always managed things. Foreign policy and development policy is a combination of values and interests. Always has been, ever since, as Christina said, JFK launched USAID. And the fact that it seems that the only thing that the US government currently is talking about is its own interests is kind of gross, given how wealthy the US government is, the US is. So let's not like just forget that, but let's focus on interests. And I think that, funnily enough, you could have shown a clip by Marco Rubio, it's doing the rounds on social media, a few years ago, making precisely the case that you're just asking me to make. So Marco Rubio understands very, very well the importance of development cooperation for the interests of the US. And there are short-term interests and there are long-term interests. And if you just focus on the short-term interests, it's possible to say that stability in various countries, girls' education, global health, all of those things aren't that important for the next couple of years in the US. It's unlikely that it's going to make a huge difference. But, sensible governments and sensible countries don't just think about the next couple of years. They think about the next decade, the next few decades. Mm-hmm. And the long-term self-interest, let's call it that, I would call it mutual benefit for all countries. But yeah, the national interest of all countries engaged in development cooperation and mutual cooperation is clear. It's clear in terms of stability around the world. It's clear in terms of economic trading opportunities. Really crucially, it's clear in terms of the impact that, or the investment we have to make to reverse incredibly damaging climate change that this US administration wants to deny. So they have a kind of an understanding of things, which really doesn't follow the science, mm-hmm. doesn't follow a sensible analysis of medium to long-term foreign policy interests. And so, is there an economic interest? Well, actually, there is. And it's actually one of the great criticisms of USAID, that a huge amount of money of USAID goes straight into the US economy, into Washington, D.C. Quite a small amount ends up in local organizations. And that's a scandal. And it's something that USAID has been trying to change over the years. So the difficult thing at the moment for critics and experts like myself and Christina is to try and work out, how do you support the general approach of a development agency while also maintaining the right to criticize the way that it's operated, because it has operated in a way that deserves to be criticized. So that's the balance we're trying to strike at the moment. But I think what we're getting to is that, out of every crisis, an opportunity. And I think Trump has just made clearer than ever that the aid system, and you implied this at the beginning, does need to change. It's 2025, not 1965. We need to build a different system reflecting the different levels of participation of countries all over the world. It's not a donor-recipient system anymore. It's not aid. It shouldn't be. It should be every country contributing and every country benefiting, and therefore every country deciding how a larger part of international public finance is spent. And can I just end with this? The idea that we can leave international development, climate change, global health, all the public goods that we care about, to the private sector and to a handful of billionaires is absurd. Yeah, public spending is always complicated, right? At the national level, in Poland, in the US, it's interests, it's complex, it's politics. That's the same at the international level, of course it is. But we need tons more international public money. And the fact that Trump has come in with this crazy vandalism does not mean that that's wrong. It means that we have to make our case stronger and we have to win politically.
Well, there seems to be a lot of complexities here to unpack, but the one thing that we most certainly have learned over the last few weeks is that complexities are not something that would be particularly popular with the new Trump administration. A lot of interesting ideas emerged in that conversation. It would be very interesting to see them materialize in the real world, so we will most certainly follow up on most of them in our future episodes. This is all we have time for tonight. Jonathan Glini and Christina Beige were our guests tonight. Thank you very much. There is no consensus on how to move forward after the shock induced by the Trump administration. For all intents and purposes, there is no going back to the old ways. America is no longer interested in leading, and the post-war order is pretty much gone. How the world moves on from this remains an open question, but also an opportunity, provided we see it as one. Thank you for being with us tonight. Next week, we will ask one of the most provocative questions in international politics. Did Brexit make any sense at all? Join us to find out next Wednesday, and have a good evening.